yesterday we talked about another conflict regarding Texas. Now, this is a conflict that will also kind of involve Texas. So, like I mentioned before, it is very easy to get these two things confused. So, just make sure you don't. That's all I can say about that. So, remember, we ended yesterday with Texas gaining their independence from Mexico and then existing as an independent country for a while. Only state that was ever its own country by itself. But eventually it was annexed by the United States despite a lot of opposition. What were some of the reasons why a lot of Americans and a lot of leaders didn't want to annex Texas? Yep. Right, it'd be a slave state and give more power to the slave state. There was a big worry it was going to start a war with Mexico. Yes, because Mexico still considers Texas, or at least parts of Texas, to belong to them. And so they were worried that this would upset Mexico and poison those relationships and make things very difficult. And they turned out to be quite right about that. But it ends up being annexed by joint resolution, which was a way to kind of get around that opposition because there was no way they were going to get a full treaty. There was no way they were going to get the 2/3 support in Congress to get a full treaty. So they had to do it by joint resolution. But a lot of folks by that time saw gaining Texas as part of Manifest Destiny. It was one of President Polk's campaign promises to gain Texas and to settle that Texas issue. And so he was partly making good on that promise. And also some people may have felt that a war with Mexico might actually bring more territory, or have at least felt that, yes, the war with Mexico is a risk that we take, but we take a greater risk if we allow Texas to stay independent, because for their own protection, they're eventually going to start seeking out other alliances, and we don't want them making an alliance with a more powerful nation, like, say, Britain or something, and then that's right at our border. We don't want that kind of a threat. So there were various reasons why a lot of folks in the United States saw eventually annexing Texas as a better option, even though it could potentially mean a war with Mexico. Now, we're going to start by looking at other causes of the war with Mexico. So the Texas Revolution, again, that was Texans, American settlers, fighting Mexico for the independence of Texas. And while it did include a lot of volunteers from the United States, and most certainly the United States was sort of rooting for those Texan settlers, that was a completely different conflict. The Mexican War is when the United States will fight Mexico over multiple things, mainly territory, which begins in 1846 and concludes in 1848. Now, we've mentioned this guy's name a couple of times, but we need to put more of a fine point on it because he is an important person to know in all of this, and that is the president. During all this stuff we've already talked about, President James K. Polk. President James K. Polk ran for president, won the presidency in 1844. When you think of President Polk, think of Manifest Destiny. He is your Manifest Destiny president. There were lots of presidents, so certainly several that believed in Manifest Destiny to some end. But for President Polk, it's really a part of his branding. That is part of his, his whole mission, his whole set of goals as president was to bring about expansion. He believed firmly in Manifest Destiny and believed that the United States should expand, had a right to expand, and he campaigns on it. That is practically what his presidential campaign was all about. Those were his promises, were to expand the United States, and he wins the presidency based on that. President Polk, or James K. Polk, when he runs for president, he has kind of three specific goals, three specific promises having to do with Manifest Destiny that he is talking about while he's campaigning and then while he is president. One is Oregon. He wants to resolve the Oregon dispute. We talked about that a couple of days ago. And furthermore, he was one of those proponents of a certain slogan. What was that slogan? 54-40 or fight. That was James K. Polk. Okay? So he and his campaign, all his supporters, not only was he saying we're going to settle this Oregon question, but promising to settle it with a whole 54-40 line, or promising, we're going to get more of Oregon or we will fight for it. So he ran on that 54-40 or fight idea. Also to gain California. So another one of his goals, another one of his promises was to gain California, which at the time was part of Mexico. All of that was Mexico. But the United States is becoming more and more interested in California, not yet for gold. Gold had not quite been discovered there yet, but for ranching and farming and, further expansion across the continent. Manifest Destiny was this belief that the United States had to expand from sea to shining sea, right? So that eventually means acquiring California. And thirdly, to settle the Texas question, to gain Texas. Okay, gain Texas. The Texas thing had been lingering in the minds of people for, about 19 years by that point. Texas was an independent nation at the moment. It had been recognized by the United States, but James K. Polk runs on the platform of we are going to acquire Texas. So those are his three things, his punch list: Oregon, Texas, California. And we will see, we already know with Oregon and with Texas that President Polk makes good on all three of those. He's probably one of the only presidents that can truly say whether they did it, well or not is a different story, if it was right or wrong. But one of the only presidents that, campaigns on specific things and actually accomplishes all of those three things. And that's not meant to demean other presidents. There's other reasons why stuff doesn't get done. There's only so much a president can truly do on their own. But President Polk is able to do that in just one term as president. So the Texas thing, Texas annexation, we already talked about that. We know he makes good on that with Texas annexation in 1845. They will also eventually, will make good on the Oregon thing, although they will back down, remember, from 54-40 and eventually go to the 49th parallel, but he will make good on that promise as well. So President Polk is going to be president during the Mexican War, which is going to result in the acquisition of lots of new territory for the United States, including California. But we want to talk about the background causes to it. One of the main background causes to the Mexican War is obviously going to be about Texas. We know already that Mexico is none too happy that the United States has annexed Texas and has always kind of felt like the United States was somehow plotting to get Texas from the beginning, and they're really sore about that whole thing and have been for a long time. But more specifically, there's a boundary dispute in Texas. There's a more specific dispute or argument over exactly where the boundary of Texas is, exactly where Texas ends and where Mexico begins. And these two locations, these are the disputed area, the claims that each side is claiming to be the boundary of Texas. The United States says that it's the Rio Grande. So the Rio Grande is where the United States is saying the boundary of Texas is. Some of you may recognize that as the modern-day boundary between the United States and Mexico. So the Rio Grande River being right there. So the United States says that is the boundary of Texas. This is where the United States ends and where Mexico begins. Mexico, however, claims that the boundary of Texas is the Nueces River. So they say it is the Nueces River, which is about, depending on exactly where you are, but somewhere around 150 or so miles north of that. This is the Nueces River right here. So you can see that it runs further north. And so that leaves in between all of this area that is disputed. In other words, both the United States and Mexico are claiming all of that to belong to them. So there's this overall resentment that the United States has, acquired Texas, but where there's a much more tangible dispute and where you can clearly see that there's going to be potential for violence to break out there, potential for actual fighting to break out, because both the United States and Mexico are claiming that territory to belong to them. So that is a very important cause of the Mexican War. There's also the issue of California. I mentioned a moment ago that one of President Polk's campaign promises and one of the goals that he has for the United States is to acquire California. And so when he becomes president, he starts to, begin that process and try to open those negotiations in order to gain California, which again was part of Mexico. So he sends this person, John Slidell. John Slidell was an official, a diplomat, but he was sent to Mexico to talk and try to negotiate the purchase of California. So Polk wants California. He sends Slidell as an ambassador and a diplomat, to talk to the Mexican government and offer to buy it, offering to purchase it. So they're not trying to take it over, not trying to, take it by force, at least not yet, trying to offer to purchase it. So what do you think the Mexican government thinks about that? No way. They're certainly not about to sell California. But not only that, it's not just a polite decline, no thank you, we'll keep it. They're just insulted at the very idea. They are insulted at the very notion that the United States would even try to buy California. They see this as a complete slap in the face. Recall that Mexico's already very, very bitter over the Texas thing, and the fact now that the United States is trying to purchase California, it just kind of makes Mexico feel like the United States is just after all their land and all their territory, and it just, to them, sort of proves that the United States is aggressive and trying to gain more and more land, so forth and so on. So they are so angry, they refuse to even meet with Slidell. Like I said, it's not like it's a nice little business meeting resulting in Mexico saying thanks, but no thanks. They won't even meet with the guy. And that makes Polk really, really mad, because not only other people in the United States, particularly Manifest Destiny advocates, are really angry. Because not only does that mean they're not going to get California, at least not by, diplomatic means, they saw it as insulting, that the diplomat was rejected and that Mexico wouldn't even hear of it and they wouldn't discuss it. And they're angry about that. So this leads to more tension and more bitterness and just more bad feelings and a further deterioration of the relationship between Mexico and the United States. So the California thing is a part of it. They're angry over the Texas being annexed, and then you have that specific boundary dispute over where the boundary of Texas actually is. Now, before we get into the war itself, we want to talk about kind of how various people in the United States might have felt about this, because all wars, always have their divisions. There's never a conflict where 100% of people are always in favor of it or whatever. Now, you have some where it's far more united than others, and some wars where it's far more divided than others. This war was pretty divisive in the United States, certainly not as divisive as some other things we'll get, but it wasn't near as united of a front as we saw in some other American conflicts. So there were a lot of people when the war breaks out that were quite opposed to this, and Saul will see this war as unjust. People that were opposed to the wars will see this as just unjustified, will see this as the United States being aggressive. They will see it as the United States being, like trying to be like an imperial power, like the United States trying to take over territory that we don't have a right to, or territory that is not rightfully ours, and just kind of looking for reasons to fight with Mexico in order to take over more land. So for some people, this just looks like the United States, or feels like the United States is being greedy, like the United States is just trying to take over, is being, kind of like some of these European powers that have come through over the centuries and taken over these people and taken over those people and established colonies everywhere. It feels a lot like that. And today would argue that, that's not the kind of thing the United States was founded on. We're supposed to be people that are objective or object to, colonization, object to people being ruled over and that kind of thing. A lot of people opposed to the war also feared or even suspected that this was kind of like a plot to further slavery, that this was about expanding slavery, or that it could potentially mean the expansion of slavery. So, at best, people that felt that way may have felt, if this happens and if we gain more land and if all this stuff takes place, that's potentially more territory for slavery to expand to, which by this time, that created, of course, a political power issue. But by this time, it's also raising some more moral questions, because the abolition movement is more significant by this point. Still not a majority movement, but there were more people questioning the morality of slavery and whether or not it ought to be allowed to expand further westward. At worst, people that felt that way would argue that this was just a downright conspiracy, by slave states and by the slave powers and all that, to spread slavery and just to keep on letting it spread, and then to keep on going all the way into South America, maybe. Some of them may have been in that extreme with it. So a lot of people see this as unjustified, that it's the United States being greedy, that it is, potentially going to expand slavery or is meant to do that. But then obviously you have lots of people that supported this conflict and that were very excited about it, that were quite jubilant, that may have even, been hoping that this would lead to war, kind of pleased when diplomacy doesn't work out, and perhaps pleased when, attempts to try to fix things with Mexico don't work out and they end up fighting over stuff. Support for the war particularly would have been from those Manifest Destiny advocates, the people that believed firmly in Manifest Destiny and that the United States should and would and had a right and all of that to expand. Because for many, the goal was clear. This wasn't just about, smoothing things over with Mexico. This is about territory. This would mean territory, whether that was Texas, California, and all of that. And there were many people, of course, that saw that as part of the United States' destiny, that were, thrilled with the prospect of economic expansion. So it's a very,
let me give this back and so I don't come get it at the end of the day.
okay, thanks. Very clear goal in mind of expansion. Okay, so we have our background causes. We know why people are going to be either for or against this once it gets going. Now I want to take a look at the immediate cause. What causes the outbreak of the violence when the war first begins? And this will also help us to see why some people are opposed to the war itself. We said a moment ago that some Americans will see this whole thing as just an excuse to grab territory, that it was not justified, that the United States didn't have good enough of a reason, or, as you're going to see here, some will go as far as to say the United States kind of made up a reason because they wanted to fight, and so they found something that they could blow out of proportion or exaggerate or maybe even outright lie about in order to give a reason to go to Congress and say, hey, we want to go to war. So let's talk about where the war broke out. Now, as we looked at a moment ago, there is this question over the boundary of Texas. And I mentioned that was, potentially going to be a place for violence to break out pretty easily, because you've got a pretty large area there that both the United States and Mexico are claiming. And so the war is going to begin when General Zachary Taylor, all of this is related to the outbreak of war, just breaking down how the war began. General Zachary Taylor was commanding American troops there in Texas, right there at that border, around the Nueces River. For the time being, the United States was staying on that side of the Nueces River, so as to not anger Mexico. And General Zachary Taylor was in command of American forces right there on the border. Well, President Polk orders General Zachary Taylor to take his troops across the Nueces River. In other words, the president orders General Taylor to move his troops into that disputed territory. And when he moves those troops into that disputed territory, what do you think is going to happen? There's a fight's going to break out, right, between the American forces there and Mexican forces, and that's exactly what happens. So a fight breaks out, a skirmish breaks out in that disputed territory between General Taylor and Mexican forces. And so now, what could President Polk argue? What could he say? They attacked us. They attacked us. General Taylor can say that. Polk can say that. This phrase is used. President Polk goes to Congress and says, American blood has been spilt on American soil. Now, from Polk's point of view, how could they argue that this was an attack on the United States?
Because the Rio Grande is supposed to be the border.
Right. He can say this is our territory. The Rio Grande is the boundary. We were in our territory. Mexico shouldn't have been there. They came over and attacked us on our own land. We have to fight back. We have to declare war. However, from the point of view of the Mexican government, what might they say?
That the US.
Our territory, yeah. You crossed over into our land. We're just defending our land. So you can see how both sides can take the defensive here and say that they didn't do anything wrong and so forth and so on. And that certainly was an argument not just that Mexico would make, that was certainly an argument that some Americans would even make. And the other things that made this quite controversial was some of the exact details of this, of exactly where it happened and exactly who shot first and all that sort of stuff was real sketchy and unclear, and some information seemed to be conflicting. And so there were a few congressmen that were not won over by this, and they demanded to know, tell us, we want more information about exactly what happened here. They're never able to really produce that. And so some would argue, and some still do, that this was really kind of provoked. What do we mean by provoked?
America just was like poking the bear.
Yeah, that folks sent Zachary Taylor into that disputatory knowing what? Knowing they would attack, and then he could do what? Now he can go to Congress and say, oh, they attacked us, So you can see how a lot of people would be opposed to this and would argue that it was never justified. The United States kind of invented a reason, or, a very good analogy, poke the bear to kind of, make them attack, so forth and so on. But to others, they may have felt that the United States truly was attacked, or said, doesn't matter, we've got to go to war anyway. And so for this reason, the United States declares war despite some opposition in Congress and despite a lot of arguing about it. The United States declared war on Mexico in 1846. And that war itself, we will look at later. We're gonna stop there with the outbreak of the war. And the United States is pretty ill prepared for war. Doesn't have a very big standing army. Doesn't have really too much of a plan. So there's a lot of organizing that needs to be done. But the thing is, as ill prepared and as unready for a war as the United States is, Mexico is perhaps a little bit more unprepared and a little bit more unready. So we will see later the war pan out, and eventually it moves far beyond just Texas, and we'll see how the United States fares in that war and the vast amount of territory the United States is going to gain as a result of that war. All right, so we'll finish that up a little bit later. Questions on that much? Okay. So in a few minutes, we're going to start our essay and talk about it for just a couple of moments before we begin. I am going to put the question up, so I'm going to put it up right now. I'm going to put the question up on the screen for a few minutes as you start writing. You should have it written down, but in case you do not, I will have it on the screen here for a minute. Don't start writing just yet. Let me pull it up and just talk about it